So the question is, what do you do when you're recording your metal guitars and your low end is just out of control no matter what you do? And also, how do you go about mixing screaming vocals that vary from track to track as far as character and frequency response? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 20. So before we dive into this excellent group of questions submitted by subscribers, I just want to let you know that you can now have direct access to my guitar production workshop. In this free training, I show you exactly how I go about dialing in a metal guitar tone at the source, how I go about editing my guitar tracks, and finally my simple and straightforward approach to mixing heavy guitars in a pro level production. The workshop is 100% free, and there's a link below that you can click and have direct access to it right now. Okay, our first question here comes from Nacetone. Hey Bobby, first of all, thank you very much for your awesome and informative videos. They truly are helpful. You mentioned close miking cymbals for metal productions, and I quite like the idea. I want to know if you still make the mics for left and the right crash equidistant from the snare. Seems like the technique could ignore that rule. Also, how close would be too close for mic placement? And lastly, do you place the mics above the center of the cymbals to avoid that washy sound effect, or do you mic near the edge, or does it depend? Thank you so much, and cheers from Slovenia. All right, man, well, this is an excellent question, and you are correct in assuming that I don't pay attention to the placement of the snare, unless I'm miking my drum kit with a traditional space pair of overheads. But more often than not, I'm spot miking either individual cymbals or groups of cymbals. And I close mic my cymbals usually about 1 foot to 1.5 feet above the actual cymbal or pair of cymbals and close to the edge. I don't have that washy sound problem as long as it's not too close to the cymbal. I have had situations where I did mic it too close, but I always check before I record the drums for real. And if it's too close, I simply raise the microphone by another couple inches or maybe even 1/2 foot. Now, for anyone who's watching, if you're wondering why I don't use a traditional pair of spaced overheads, the reason is simple. For metal drums or heavy drum tracks, generally I want to just capture cymbals in my cymbal mics so I can reject the hi-hat. If you have any experience recording live drums, you probably know that hi-hats generally are way too loud in all of your mics, whether it's the bleed or the overheads themselves. So for metal or hard rock, I'll generally glue the sound of my kit together in the mix with my room mics, but my cymbal mics are simply cymbal mics. And if you ever listen to any of my actual cymbal mic tracks, there's very little snare drum in those tracks. Again, if it's a situation where I'm recording like an indie rock band or maybe a lighter rock band and I want to go for a more traditional drum miking setup, then I will make sure that both mics are equal to one another as far as their distance to the snare, so the snare is not lopsided in the overhead tracks. But for 95% of the time, I don't worry about it because there's hardly any snare in my cymbal mics anyway. So dude, excellent question. Hopefully that clears it up for you. And our next question here comes from Relapse Encore. Question: how do you keep your master bus from clipping with the amount of tracks you have? When I record guitars, I keep them at -12 dB. With drums, I set them to -6, keeping the spikes from clipping, but still manage to clip the master channel at around 2.3. Any thoughts? Well, this is a great question, and dude, I'm gonna be honest, I don't pay attention to numbers for the most part while I mix. Now, the way I go about mixing, for example, over 100 tracks, which unfortunately these days, that's generally what I get sent, I just make sure that my fader level is low enough that I don't clip my master fader. You gotta remember, when it comes to levels and mixing, it's all relative. The more tracks you have, the more output signal will be coming through your master fader. So without even paying attention or thinking about it, I just make sure that everything is gain staged properly during my rough mix, so there's no clipping on my master fader. And that's all there is to it. There's no magic trick to it. You just gotta make sure that nothing is getting out of control. And if things are too loud and clipping at your master fader, just bring all of your tracks down and you should be good to rock. Excellent question. Okay, our next question here comes from Zilios627. Love the content. Would you happen to have anything on mixing screaming vocals ranging from highs, mids, and lows? Would each range have to be handled differently? All right, well, this is an awesome question, and more often than not, yes, I do have to EQ them in a slightly different manner. More so with high screams versus lows and mids. Lows and mids, generally I EQ the same way. Also, it really depends on the actual screamer themselves, but in general, higher screams will have upper harmonics that are very annoying and very harsh to listen to, for the most part above 8K. So let's say I'm mixing a screamer that has a lot of that like high end gargle at the top end of their voice. I'll just take a high shell filter and reduce all frequencies above, for example, 8K. I generally have to do this more with high screams than, like I said, mid screams or lower screams. Now, there are screamers that even in the mid-range have a lot of that high-end stuff that I want to get rid of, and I'll just apply the same technique to their mid-range screams. I'll definitely be doing a tutorial on this in the near future, but in general, that's my approach. An excellent question. Okay, and our final question here comes from Mr. Davor. I use a Marshall DSL-20HR and an MX-112. So nothing super powerful that should be causing a problem. Rather, it just seems that the mic picks up palm mutes at or below the C power chord with a very extreme bass boost. The bass boost is clearly noticeable in the waveform within my DAW. Either way, the resulting rhythm tracks during those sections are off, making the guitars jump out in an unpleasant way and with bassy, boomy aspects dominating the good parts of the guitar tone. Is this something that is typically addressed in the mixing stage? Is this a routine issue for you? And if yes, how is it best handled? I appreciate your time and help. Okay, well, Davor, this is an excellent question, and this is something that we generally all face with all heavy guitar tones with a lot of chugging happening. Now, I just want to say this before I get into the mixing end of things. If it's really extreme, then in general, it's probably that something is off with the EQ on your head or your amp. You probably have too much low-end information happening at the source. Now, what I like to do is I try to get a tone that sounds great in the room when I'm miking up a cab, and then I simply place the mic and start messing around with mic placement. Now, as far as proximity effect and it build up a low end, for miking guitar cabs, I generally like to keep my microphone nice and close, so I wouldn't tend to pull the microphone away to reduce bottom end. Like I said, I'd rather adjust that at the head. Now, with that being said, even when your tone is 100% dialed in and sounding great at the source, you're generally gonna have some subtle low end buildup in the mix on your rhythm guitars for metal. It's very, very common. Now, what I like to do is I like to use a multi-band compressor on my rhythm guitar bus, and I generally will bypass all of the bands and only compress between 80 hertz and around 250 hertz. So the rest of the guitar signal is untouched. And what'll end up happening is gain reduction will only take place when the palm mutes get out of control on the rhythm guitar tracks. And like I said, even when you have a well-balanced tone, if it's really, really heavy music, you're gonna have a slight low-end buildup on those chugs. But if it's really out of control and you could physically see a ton of it on the waveform before you even get into mixing, then I would definitely recommend getting that right at the preamp section on your guitar head or amp. Now, I know metal guitar tone is such a pain point for so many of us metal engineers, but the truth is there is no magic trick to it. It's all about getting your tone right at the source. And it doesn't require high-end gear or guitars or microphones or preamps or cabs or heads. It's just paying attention to the fundamentals. So thank you for your submission, and hopefully that helps you out. So I'd just like to shout out and thank everyone for submitting this excellent group of questions. And if you've emailed me a question and I haven't gotten to it yet, just be patient. I will definitely get to it within one of these upcoming videos within this series. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. Now, on the topic of guitar tone and recording guitars and producing guitars and mixing guitars, you could have direct access to my guitar production workshop for absolutely free. There's a link below to the free workshop in this video's description. And until next time, happy mixing.